Alright, today I'm going to talk about pivot tables, and I'm going to start with Access. The idea with Access is a database. Databases are good for holding data, storing data, ensuring that data is tied together properly. But Access and tools like Access are not good for manipulating data necessarily. So let me try that again. So if I wanted to ask a question, I've got a list of sports apparel retailers here. If I wanted to ask a question like how many retailers I've got in California, or what's the average sales of my retailers in Washington, the data is here to answer those questions, but there's not a good way of getting it. I would have to write a program to read the data or write a query or something like that. I could sort it by state, for example, and that would get me part of the way there because at least all of the retailers from, say, California would be together. But there's still not a good way to answer specific questions like the ones I started with. So while Access is good for storing data, it's not good for manipulating and reporting data. For that, we need something like Excel. Excel is much better for working with data and manipulating it. Access is better for storing it. So if I open up Excel, here I've got the same data that I was just looking at in Excel. And so we can see the familiar, rows and columns here. Data is the same. The field names that I had in Access are at the top of the data. So I've got a company name, a street address, a city, a state, a zip code, etc., as well as some information about ordering dates. So I've got the company's first order date, their last order date, the number of orders, and the total sales. So in Access, I can work with the data, but there's still, to answer the kinds of questions that I started with, such as how many vendors have I got in California, I'd still have to manipulate it a little bit. So I would still need to I could do it a number of ways. I could sort it by state and then count the rows, or I could use a count function that we went over earlier in the semester, or a count if function, something like that. But an easier way to work with the data sort of dynamically and be able to change the data to appear however I want is using a pivot table. So a pivot table is a form of online analytical processing, which we talked about when we discussed business intelligence and business analytics. The way to create a pivot table is to first select the data that you want to create the pivot table for. So let's say we want to create a pivot table for all of this data. We've got about 2,000 vendors or so. So we want to create a pivot table to summarize this. I'm going to place my select a cell that is somewhere in the middle of this data, and I'm then going to go in Excel to insert the insert menu and then pivot table. And once I do that, Excel is going to grab the data that I'm interested in, and it's going to create a pivot table for it. So if you if you select a cell that's somewhere in the middle of the data, Excel is going to automatically select the surrounding data and stick it in the pivot table. If you don't do it that way, what you can do is just select your data yourself. So I can go from say A1 down through J 1994, for example, and say insert pivot table, and essentially it does the same thing. You're going to say insert pivot table. It's going to put the data on either a new worksheet or an existing worksheet. I'm going to say new worksheet, and Excel puts in this new worksheet with my pivot table report on it. And essentially what you've got with the pivot table is you've got your report area over to the left, so that's this area over here, and then over to the right you've got something called the field list, and the field list is basically the stuff, the fields that you're going to add to your pivot table. Alright, so now let's add some fields. So let's start with the question, how many retailers do I have in each state? Alright, so if I look over on my field list, I have a list of fields, and the list of fields is generated, if you go back to your data, basically whatever you've got in row number 1 becomes your field names. So here I've got a field called company name. This corresponds to the company name field that was in my Access database, and because I have the word company name in the first row, Excel assumes that that's going to be the name of one of my fields. All right, so I have I have a field for state right here. So if I select that, it adds it to the report. And essentially what happens is the pivot table is going to go through all of the data, and it's going to figure out what are all the different states that are present in this data, and it's going to create a row on my pivot table report for each of those states. Okay, so my data contains these 5 states: Alaska, California, Hawaii, Oregon, and Washington. And let me go ahead and make this font a little bit bigger so that we can see it a little easier. You've got all the same formatting stuff with pivot tables that you do anywhere else in Excel. If I click somewhere in my report, then my field list will show back up on the right. So here's my states. Now if I want to figure out how many retailers I've got in each state, for example, then I need to add something to the report that will give me a count. So if I do total sales, for example, actually let's start with that. Let's start with total sales instead of a number of retailers. So if I do total sales, I click on that and add it to the report, then it's going to add the total sales to my report. So in other words, the pivot table is going to go to my data. It's going to add up all the sales for all of the customers in each state, and it's going to give me that total by state, because in this example I've got state as a row label. I've indicated I want to have it by state. If I then decide, well, state is not detailed enough, I really would like it by city, I can come over to my field list and I can add city. I can add city just by selecting this box. And what this does is it puts in another layer underneath what I already had. So I still have the state on the report, so I still have the state and a list or a sum of the total sales. But now underneath that, I have it broken out by city. So in Alaska, I've got 6 million something total sales, and if I break it down by city, it looks like this. And I can do the same thing in California and all the other states that I've got. If I then decide this still isn't detailed enough, I want it by zip code, then I can add the field for zip code, and it'll show me the individual zip codes within each state. And then if I decide that's too much information, I can click on zip code again and it'll remove it. So really the powerful thing about pivot tables is this flexibility. You can add things to the report, you can remove things. If you decide you want to look at something a different way, you can do that right away. You don't have to generate a whole other query or write a whole other program. You can just sort of do it on the fly. So it's dynamic. All right, so some other things for pivot tables. Your actual report is over here on the left side of your screen. Over on the right, you've got the field list, and then you've got 4 main areas, and we're going to concern ourselves with 3 of those. One is the row labels. So when you add a field to a pivot table report, essentially by default, it's either going to go in as a row label or as a value. And as a general rule, text fields and date fields will go in as row labels. So if you add a row label for city or state, or for a date, Excel is going to assume, well, he's adding a row for state, he must want to look at this data by state. So it puts it in as a row label. Now if you add a value field, or I should say a numeric field, Excel is going to put that on your report as a value. Because values are things that can be summed and totaled and averaged and things like that. So if you add a number field, it's going to go in as a value. So sales is in here as a value. When you add a numeric field, by default, it's going to go in as a sum. Okay, so I've got sum of sales here. If I decide I don't want that, then I can go over here to the values area. Here it tells me it's sum of total sales. If I click on that field, I get some options, one of which is value field settings. So I get value field settings, and I can change this from a sum to a count, or an average, or a few other things. So if I say count and say OK, then that's going to give me a count of the number of records I have for each of these states and cities for this example. So this is really the answer to how many companies do I have in each state, or in each city and each state in this case. If I wanted to change that to an average, then I could do that, and it would give me the average sales by city and state. Another way to get a count is to take a text field and drag it to the values area. All right, so if I do, let's say if I take the city, if I take, right now city is in here as a row label. If I take that and I drag it to values, then it's going to turn it into a count. Because the idea is, if you put a text field like city, and by text field I mean it's letters, it's descriptive, right? It's not something that you can add and subtract, etc. So if you try to put that in as a value field, Excel is going to say, well, I can't really create a sum or an average, but what I can do is create a count of all the different cities that I've got in that state. Okay, so if you put a text field into the values area, it'll generate a count for you. And so now I can see I've got my row labels here for my states. My city is now in here as a count. So I've got in California 1,668 different rows, in Alaska 21 different rows, etc. Right, and so those correspond to the different vendors. Still have average of total sales here in the middle. All right, let's go back to, I'm going to take my my city and I'm going to drag it back over to my row labels. So now it's back on the report as a row label. And I'm also going to change my average of total sales back to the sum of total sales, okay, to demonstrate a couple of other things. All right, so first of all, let's say that I would like to, I like this report, but really I only want to see the data for Alaska. Maybe I want to send this report to the sales manager in Alaska. So I'd like to be able to just show Alaska, but also have this report. So one way to do that is I can. No, that's not the easiest way to do it. Never mind. One way I can do that is to go over to the row labels area. Right now I've got state in there as a row label. I'm going to take the state, and instead of a row label, I'm going to drag it up to this other section called report filter. Okay, and if I do that, you'll notice that the state is no longer on the report. Okay, so now the row labels are the city. Okay, that's all I've got on the report. But instead, at the top, I've got this extra thing that says state, and then it says all. And if I click on that, I can see that right now it's showing me all of the states. Well, if I just click on Alaska, and then I say OK, I get the report, but now it's filtered for Alaska. All right, so it's just showing me Alaska, all the cities within Alaska, and the grand total at the bottom. If I change that to, let's say, Hawaii, then now it's showing me all of the all of the cities within Hawaii and their totals. All right, so really it's the same report, or it's showing me the same data it was showing me before. The difference is right now I've got it filtered for a particular state, and also the state itself is not showing up in the report. It's showing up here in the header as a report filter. All right, so mostly the same, but slightly different way of looking at the data. Let's say that I want to look at it by zip code. All right, so maybe I could add the zip code to the report, okay, like I had before. But let's say this is really too much detail. What I'd really like to do is filter it somehow. All right, so to do that, a filter, instead of adding it to the report, I'm going to add something called a slicer. Okay, so if you go up to Pivot Table Tools from your menu, and you go to Options and then Insert Slicer, I'll get another field list. And so if I want to insert a slicer for zip code, I would select that and say OK. And basically what I get is another menu that has all the zip codes in it. And a slicer is like a temporary filter. So if I select a particular zip code, then it's going to filter my report based on that zip code. Then if I choose another zip code, it's going to filter it based on that zip code, etc. So this is another dynamic way to filter the report in different ways. And when I'm done filtering the report, I can say clear filter, get rid of it, and now it's showing me all of the data again. Okay. To get rid of the slicer window, you just select the window and hit the delete key, and it makes it go away. A couple other things. Let's work with dates for a minute. So let's say I'm going to go back to, I'm going to remove city from the report. Okay, so I'm going to click on city and say remove field. So now I'm just back to my row labels and my sum of sales. All right, so let's say I've got a hypothesis. My hypothesis is people who have been customers longer spend more money on average than other customers. Okay, that's my hypothesis going in, and I want to test that. So to do that, I'm going to use, I have a field called first order date, and that field tells me when did this customer place their first order with me. So I select that. All right, and now it's giving me the first order dates. So the issue is everybody on my list could potentially have a different first order date. Okay, so I may have two people, one person who first ordered July 14th, 1995, another person who first ordered July 17th, 1995. Well, in terms of my hypothesis, those customers are virtually the same, right? They both started ordering in 1995, so they're customers that have been around for a while, but in terms of the report, they first ordered on different dates, so those are showing up as two different lines on the report. I would like to have some sort of a grouping so that I can look at it by year or by chunks of years or something like that. So if I click on this date field, okay, and I say, I go to, again, Pivot Table Tools, and then Group Selection, okay, I get a grouping, and it says starting at, ending at, and then I've got by, and then I can choose seconds, minutes, hours, days, months, quarters, or years. I'll choose years. Okay, so if I select years and OK, Then what it will do is it'll collapse all of those different dates into years. Okay, so I've got all the people that first started ordering in 1996 their sum of sales was this. All the people that ordered in 2006, their sum of sales was this. All right, so this data is a little bit easier to digest than a long list of individual dates. So that's one way that's one way that you can aggregate the data. Let's say I've got another hypothesis. I'm going to remove the first order date. Let's say I have another hypothesis that says people that place a larger number of orders place or generate a higher average sales. All right, so more orders also means higher average sales. How can I test that? Well, I've got a field here for number of orders. If I add that to the report, first of all, it's a numeric field, so it's going to stick it in as a value. I don't want it as a value. I would like it as a row. So I'm going to drag that field from the value over to the row. And so what this is showing me now is in Alaska, people who placed 8 orders, their sum of sales was $73.84. People who placed 120 orders, their sum of sales was $662.880, etc. So this is kind of like the issue I had with the last analysis. Each number is different, and what I would rather do is get some grouping. So first I'm going to change the sum of sales to the average of sales, because that's what I said I wanted. And then I'm going to click on this field here, number of orders, and I'm going to go to group selection again. But this time I'm not working with a date field, I'm working with a number field, and so my grouping looks a little bit different. It says it's going to start me at 2, end me at 781, and it's going to group me by 100. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Actually, I'm going to make the group simpler. I'm going to say starting at 0 and ending at 800. Okay, so 2 and 781 are the biggest and smallest values in my data. To simplify, I'm going to change it to 0 to 800, and I'll say OK. All right, now, so what this shows me is now I've got these groupings. So for people that placed between 0 and 99 orders, their average sales were 110,000. People that placed from 100 to 199 orders, their average total sales was 405,030, etc., etc. Okay, so again, I've got these groupings that are a little bit easier to understand than what I had originally. Let's say I want to figure out which grouping gives me the highest average sales. Well, I can look over it and kind of see it looks like this 200 to 299. A more systematic way of doing it is to click on the average total sales and sort it. Now with pivot tables, sorting is context sensitive. So if I've selected average total sales, some value in there, and I say sort, then it's going to sort my data based on that. On the other hand, if I click on the average total sales at the state level and I say sort, then it's going to sort the data based on the average of sales at the state level. Or if I want to sort it alphabetically by the state name, I would click on the state name and say sort. Okay, just using this button over here, and that would sort it based on that. So depending on where you've clicked in your pivot table, your sort function and some other functions are going to behave a little bit differently. Alright, so that's all I'm going to do with pivot tables. I think that they're very useful for looking at data in multiple different ways, and a lot of organizations use them to analyze data in exactly the way we've done here. So with this information, you should be able to complete your final take-home assignment, which is take-home assignment 4. You're going to create pivot tables to answer the questions on the assignment, and you're going to plug the answers to the assignment onto the front sheet of the assignment.